So we're going to get started. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Actually, it's not morning. Good afternoon. Diana Colleen, Civic Engagement Program Officer with the California Community Foundation. Thank you all for joining us. This training is in partnership with or between the California Community Foundation, Liberty Hill, the Weingart Foundation, and United Ways LA. We are 74 days till Election Day, and the four foundations felt the need to continue the civic engagement trainings we hosted earlier this year leading up to the June primary. The goal of these trainings are to support nonprofit organizations and have them add tools to their toolbox to engage as they engage with community around the upcoming elections. This is our first of 4 trainings. Just as a reminder of the upcoming 3 trainings, you all should have received an email with the invitation for those 3 trainings, but we will be talking about civic deserts in LA County. The next training would be about nuts and bolts of an electoral field campaign, really going deep into script writing, volunteer recruitment and retention, and navigating PDI. And then the 4th and final training will be everything you need to know on how to cast a vote in LA County, your rights as a voter, important days, and different ways you can cast a vote, thanks to vote centers across the state, or VCA, the Voters' Choice Act. Just as a reminder, this training is being recorded. We will be sending a post-training email to all of the participants where you can have the link and all of the materials that will be presented. In addition to that, all of the trainings are also or will be available in CCF's YouTube channel. So if you missed a training, you can head to our YouTube channel. If you want to look at a training from earlier this year in the June primary, they are there now. So please feel free to look at them and share. Our training today is on how C3s can engage in ballot measures, and it will feature our partner Alliance for Justice. But before we get started with the presentation, before we hand it over to Nona, I want to hand it over to Anthony with the Weingart Foundation for opening remarks. So, Anthony?
Thanks, Diana. Hi, everyone. Anthony Nong, Program Officer with the Weingart Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Diana mentioned, today's webinar is part of a series of trainings that we're hoping for you all to amp up your toolbox as the upcoming election is nearing us. So again, a reminder, our next trainings are going to be on September 8th, September 22nd, and October 6th. We highly encourage you to sign up for the subsequent trainings. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's presenter, Nona Randwar, Interim Senior Legal Director of Boulder Advocacy at Alliance for Justice. Nona ensures that Boulder Advocacy offers expert training, resources, and technical assistance to support nonprofits and foundations conducting advocacy throughout the country. She leads AFJ's Boulder advocacy work in California. Nona is my to-go-to person when it comes to Boulder advocacy questions ever since meeting her a couple of years ago. Nona, the floor is now yours, and thank you so much for leading today's training on how nonprofits can engage in California ballot measures.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Diana. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. My name is Nona Randwa, and I am the Interim Senior Legal Director. Nice, easy title there. With Boulder Advocacy at Alliance for Justice. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm happy to be here with you today. I'm going to introduce my colleague Quinn Tu, who will be is another attorney in our program, and she will be staffing the Q&A box. And so because we have a lot of folks in the session today, and we have a lot to cover, she is going to be using her fast fingers to answer questions in the chat as that's appropriate. And then we'll also have time at the end to do some Q&A, and so we may lift some of them up. We may get to some of them during the session. We may lift them up at the end, or Quinn may answer them in the Q&A box. So either way, feel free to post your questions there in the Q&A box. With that, I am going to go ahead and share my screen and get started with my presentation. So, of course, we are here to talk about how nonprofits can engage around California ballot measures, and want to also do a shout out to Liberty Hill and United Way of Greater LA for their support of the session today as well, and their outreach. And so Alliance for Justice is a national nonprofit organization. Quinn and I are here in Southern California with you all. And our goal through our Boulder Advocacy Program is to support nonprofits who are engaged in advocacy. And we do that primarily by helping folks understand the legal framework that allows them to do advocacy. And so we do that in a number of ways. You have our contact information here. I mainly am mentioning this up front so that you know that even though we hope to answer all your questions today during this session, that if you have further questions or you have questions about a topic that we're not going to talk about today, please do not hesitate to reach out to us at advocacy@afj.org or the 866 number. I know Quinn just posted them in the chat. And we have an attorney each business day who is on call to answer your questions. I will mention we are closing next week for a summer break, but generally speaking, we have an attorney on call every day to answer your questions for free in English and Spanish. We also have a lot of fact sheets and publications on our website, so we really do want to be there for you as you're going through this election season to answer any questions that we can. I will say this is probably a good time to mention that although Quinn and I are attorneys and our colleagues at Boulder Advocacy are generally speaking, most of us are attorneys, we are not a law firm and we don't represent anyone or give any legal advice. So our goal is to educate you about the law so that you can get the answers that you need to move forward with your program. So enough disclaimers. Let's talk about what we're going to talk about. So we're talking about ballot measures today. What are some of the big picture considerations that your nonprofit should be thinking about when you're thinking about engaging on ballot measures? That's where we're going to start. Second thing, we're going to do a brief overview of IRS rules that apply to nonprofits that are doing ballot measure work. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that because we did a session earlier this year with CCF and we've done a lot of other trainings on IRS rules about lobbying. So if you want to seek out more information from Boulder Advocacy about that, that's definitely available from us, just not something we're going to focus on today a lot, but we're going to talk a little bit about it. So we're also going to talk about, and this is the main emphasis today, California ballot measure rules that apply to both state and local ballot measure campaigns in the state of California. So that is our main emphasis today. We're going to talk about what needs to be reported. We're going to talk about ballot measure committees and the different kinds of ballot measure committees, and what that even means, why you need to know it. And we're going to talk about activities that are not reportable and how you can redesign or restructure your work to take advantage of activities that don't have to be reported. So let's dive in. So up front, some of the things that you want to think about as you're thinking about doing ballot measure work is that there is a set of rules that apply to nonprofit 501c3 public charities around lobbying. And the IRS considers ballot measures to be lobbying supporting or opposing ballot measures to be lobbying. And so it's important for you to know, as you're thinking about supporting or opposing ballot measures, that you have, as a 501c3 public charity, if that's what you are, and I'm assuming most of the folks on the call today are, you have a limit on how much lobbying you can do. So you can do it, but you have a limit as to how much. And you have to track and report your lobbying to the IRS on your Form 990 every year. So important for you to know that you have a mechanism in place to do that reporting and to stay within your limit. Second thing you need to know is that when we are supporting and opposing ballot measures, we have to do it in a way that's quote unquote nonpartisan, which means that we're not supporting or opposing any candidates for office at the same time as we are allowed to support and oppose ballot measures, but not to support and oppose candidates. So we have to make sure we're supporting or opposing the measure, not the candidates. So those are the big picture considerations for the, from the IRS perspective for 501c3 public charities. In California, we have the Fair Political Practices Commission that regulates under state law for ballot measure disclosures and other kinds of campaign disclosures. California, and most other states actually, think of ballot measure work as campaign activity, political campaign activity. They don't think of it as lobbying, they think of it as political campaign activity. And that means the rules about what has to be reported sound a lot like campaign finance rules, because they are. One thing that means is that there are no limits on how much people can spend or do to support or oppose ballot measures in California under California law. Now, you do have an IRS limit, but California doesn't impose any kind of limit. However, there are just registration and reporting for certain kinds of activities, as I mentioned, kind of campaign finance style. So that's kind of the big picture for the California approach. Some other things for you to be thinking about when you are starting to think about doing ballot measure work. So, number one question, have you made the 501H election? And I love just starting out using random letters and numbers without explaining it. We are not going to talk a lot about this today, but there is a choice that most public charities can make about how to track and report their lobbying to the IRS, called the 501H election. And it is a test that is, just to shorthand it, most advantageous for most public charities who have a budget of $17 million or less. Even some organizations that have larger budgets prefer to use it because it offers a lot of ease and clarity. Anyway, if you don't know how you're reporting your lobbying to the IRS, and if you haven't made the 501H election, it's going to make it harder for you to do your ballot measure work, because you want to make sure that there's consistency between what gets reported for California ballot measures and what gets reported to the IRS. That those things, which will both become public reports, don't say, for instance, someone reports that you've done some ballot measure work. We'll talk about why that might happen later. And then, but unfortunately, your 990 says that you didn't do any lobbying. That would be a problem for your organization. So you want to make sure that your IRS house is in order. And usually, in most cases, it means making the 501H election and having a system to allow you to report your lobbying expenditures. So again, not going to spend a lot of time on that. Please follow up with us at Boulder Advocacy if you'd like more information about that. And come on, computer. Okay. Second big picture question. Are you coordinating with a ballot measure committee? So what this generally means is I mean, there's a legal definition of what it means, but it's pretty much what it sounds like. Is there a ballot measure committee out there who is taking the same position that you're taking on a ballot measure? And they are an entity that is doing all the reporting that's required of a ballot measure committee. And you can just kind of boost, or you kind of either respond to what they want you to do, or you sit on their steering committee, or you, talk to them about the kinds of activities that you're going to be undertaking. That is something that is important to know up front. And usually it is advantageous to be coordinating with the ballot measure committee in this context of 501c3 public charities supporting and opposing ballot measures. Usually coordinating with a ballot measure committee makes things easier. But it's important to know because it impacts the way things will get reported. Okay, so another big picture question, are you raising money that is earmarked to support or oppose a ballot measure into your organization's coffers? This is something that most of you want to avoid. It's not illegal. It is, in fact, permissible and legal. It's just that there are very significant reporting requirements that go along with doing that. And most nonprofits would choose to avoid that and structure their work in a different way. So want to make sure if you hear one thing today, don't raise money into a public charity 501c3 that's earmarked to support or oppose ballot measures without having a plan for how to report that. Okay, you heard me. Lastly, do you have any non-donor funds that are available to support this work? And that means money that came into your nonprofit because it was earned. It's rent, royalties, interest, right? Earned income. So most nonprofits, primarily our business model is we have donor funds. And I'm not just talking here about whether funds are earmarked or not. I'm talking about anything that comes from a foundation or an individual donor. Those things are donor funds. And the fact that the funds came from someone else before they came to your nonprofit, and then you would spend them on something that the state considers to be a political campaign, makes things a little bit more complicated. Sometimes at certain levels of activity, it will mean disclosing those donors in a way that is unique for 501c3s. And so if you're lucky enough to be in a position of having non-donor funds, funds that you've earned through rent or some other kind of way, to spend on ballot measure work, that will ease your reporting. So another big picture upfront consideration, and you'll see how it fits in as we go through. Okay. So I promised you a quick overview of IRS rules that apply when you're doing ballot measure work. So public charities can lobby. 501c3 public charities can lobby, but they have a limit as to how much, right? I just randomly picked our friends at LA Voice and LA Voice Action there to show you some different kinds of entities out there in the world, ACLU and others, because it's important to remember when you're doing this work that different organizations have different tax statuses, and that means that they can do different kinds of advocacy work. So different organizations will end up playing different roles for that reason. As you can see here, 501c3 public charities, they're tax exempt and they have really kind of the most advantageous tax treatment of all the different kinds of 501 of nonprofits. And that's why their advocacy activities are a little bit more limited than other kinds of groups. So 501c3s can lobby, but it's limited as to how much. And they cannot support or oppose candidates for office. So you probably have noticed that there are a lot of organizations out there, and there are more and more every year, that are different kinds of nonprofits, notably 501c4s. A lot of folks have been forming affiliated 501c4s, which is a great thing. Then we have other entities that are in the same general category, like unions and trade associations. These folks don't have a limit on how much they can lobby, which means they don't have a limit on how much they can spend on ballot measures. They are also allowed to support and oppose candidates for office. And so when we're working with them on ballot measures, they may often be taking the lead, or a ballot measure committee may be organized in the 501c4 because they don't have the lobbying limit that we have. But they also have that flexibility to support and oppose candidates for office. And so that's one reason why we need to make sure as C3s, when we're doing ballot measure work, that we're staying nonpartisan, because others may not. Okay, so again, public charities can lobby, and supporting and opposing ballot measures counts as lobbying. Furthermore, for any of you who do know that you use an expenditure test, which means that you track direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying separately and report it separately, the definitions under that 501H test that tracks things that way count ballot measure work as direct lobbying, which is nice, because you can spend more of your limit on direct lobbying. So, but you don't need to know that right now. It's just, if you need to know whether to count it as grassroots lobbying or direct lobbying, it counts as direct lobbying because the general public is in the role of legislators who are voting to adopt a new law, right? So if you are throwing a kickoff event and you are going to be talking to voters about a ballot initiative and how they can support it and why it's good, that's a lobbying event. It's a direct lobbying event. The work you do to prepare for it is preparation for direct lobbying. One thing that you should remember if you're familiar with the IRS definitions of direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying usually needs a call to action, but because this is considered direct lobbying, you don't need a call to action. So just expressing a view about a ballot measure, communicating with the general public and expressing a view about a ballot measure meets the IRS definition of lobbying and direct lobbying. So here's a tweet that was posted by Act LA, and if you're wondering, you're looking at this, think to yourself, does this express a view about a ballot measure? We have United to House LA, it's now Measure ULA. And, you know, I was looking at the clap emojis and I was thinking, does that express a view? I kind of think it does, but I wasn't sure. And then I read all the way down and they're retweeting something that says, yes, on ULA. That definitely expresses a view, right? So, when you're doing social media and it's expressing that United to House LA or whichever other ballot measure you may be working on is a good thing or a bad thing, that's something that you should be counting and tracking as lobbying for IRS purposes. I did include an example here of communications that don't count as IRS lobbying and then also likely would not be subject to any California reporting for the same reason. If you're doing educational communications, that don't express a view. They're not saying a measure is a good thing or a bad thing, but they're saying things like Measure EE would levy 16 cents per square foot of buildings located on properties within Los Angeles unified boundaries for 12 years, right? That's very much describing what the ballot measure would do. If you're listing pros and cons, that's a best practice for being able to count something as educational rather than expressing a view. If you're having a forum where you're trying to help voters understand ballot measures, if you don't want it to count as lobbying, then you should probably have a speaker who's for a ballot measure and also a speaker who's against the ballot measure, so that it's even-handed in terms of the presentation. So if you're doing it another way, that's fine. You should just consider counting it as lobbying because you might be expressing a view there. Also, if you're the speaker at a forum and you're there supporting a ballot measure and someone else is talking about opposing it, then you're lobbying. You're saying you're supporting the ballot measure. But if you're the entity that's holding the forum, you have speakers on both sides, that's probably going to be a safe educational activity that safe to not count as lobbying. Okay, so we know that under IRS, there's rules about how much we can lobby. We know it needs to be reported, stay within our limits. And that ballot measure work is direct lobbying, doesn't need a call to action. Also, under IRS rules, remember, we have to stay nonpartisan, right? We can't be supporting or opposing any particular candidates for office or any political parties in the context of the election. At the same time, we absolutely can register people to vote, get out to vote for a ballot measure. And interestingly, that's considered lobbying. So if we're having a table that says, register to vote yes on H, Pasadena for rent control, that's a lobbying communication and activity according to the IRS. Furthermore, or we're going door knocking to get out the vote and encourage, educate, let people know about the measure and that we support it and that they should vote for it. Those are lobbying activities. At the same time, we do need to make sure that we do them in a way that's nonpartisan, which means we're not referring to political parties, we're not referring to candidates. Even if people press us, we're not making any suggestions about who to vote for. Yet we can encourage people to vote for or against a measure, but not about who, which candidates to vote for. We're making the service available to everyone, and we're not, when we're kind of prioritizing our work, we're not doing it based on political party preference or any other way that would be really an effort to help support or oppose a particular candidate for office. So again, this is all good to do as long as we're doing it in a way that doesn't focus on candidates, parties, or align with candidates and parties. So this kind of gets to what 501c3's role would be in ballot measures and what some other organizations' roles might be in ballot measures. So for 501c3s, we can do it in a nonpartisan way and it counts as lobbying. We can circulate the petitions, we can endorse the measures, register voters, tell voters how to vote on the ballot measure. And then, our colleagues and partners and other organizations who are C4s or unions or others may be doing work that would be aligning the ballot measure with a candidate or a political party. They may be doing slate mailers with the Democratic Party or some other political party. And they may be joining coalitions that are endorsing candidates for office or doing other partisan work. And we can't do that as 501c3 public charities. So here's an example. It's getting dated, but hey, here it is. So There was a statewide ballot measure while Bernie Sanders was running for president, 61, it had to do with drug prices. And so this is an example of something that's aligning a candidate for office in the current election with a ballot measure, and that's not okay for 501(c)(3). So, if you're working on United to House LA, you should be wary and not be involved in any efforts, if you're a 501(c)(3) public charity, that have to do with aligning with any of the current candidates for office, candidates for mayor, city council, et cetera, as to how they stand on the ballot measure. Okay, so now I'm going to take a quick sip and I'm going to start actually talking about California ballot measure rules. I keep seeing questions pop up and go away in the chat, so I know Quinn must be working away in there. Thank you. All right, California ballot measure rules. Again, I mentioned they are about transparency for the voters so that they understand who is funding ballot measure efforts, right? And for statewide ballot measures, this information that we're going to be talking about, these reports, are featured on the Secretary of State's website, Cal Access. God bless them, they're trying hard to update that website. And that's where it all is. So you see in this example here, there's a committee called Yes on 67 to protect the plastic bag ban, right? They're a ballot measure committee. And if you have to report anything for a statewide ballot measure, it will be somewhere on the Cal Access website. If you're working on a local ballot measure, you will be reporting the same information, generally speaking, and even using, for the most part, state forms, but you'll be reporting it to your local election administrator. So like LA City Ethics Commission, et cetera, city or county entities. So under state law and under campaign finance law, we have this concept of a committee, right? A political committee, a PAC, a ballot measure PAC. There's just, people call them a lot of different things. Essentially, a ballot measure committee is any person or group of people that either raises money or spends money to support or oppose a ballot measure. And there's certain thresholds of how much you either have to raise or how much you have to spend to be considered a committee. And then committees have to do certain kinds of reporting, right? So one of the main things that I think I want you to understand here is that it is possible, and it's something that we're trying to avoid, for folks to become a committee without realizing it, right? Like I talked about raising money that's earmarked for ballot measures. That's one way that folks might become a committee without intending to become a committee. But you see some examples of committees down here. And they're the ones who have these disclosure requirements of how they have to list out what things were paid for and who their major donors are. A lot of reporting that goes into being a committee. So you want to know, this is why you're here, what do we have to report if we do ballot measure work besides our 990? When do we have to do this reporting? The way we're going to talk about it today is we're going to talk about the main ballot measure campaign, and then we're going to kind of talk about everybody else, because it's going to, when you see how it works for the main ballot measure campaign, you're going to kind of see how your efforts, I'm assuming that actually most of the folks here are not the main ballot measure campaign folks, but are nonprofits that are working with supporting ballot measure committees that are out there. So if your nonprofit houses, or you're working with a group that's housing the main ballot measure committee, a group that needs to raise money to be able to pass a ballot measure or defeat a ballot measure, that group is going to need to form a committee. because that committee is a vehicle for taking in money and spending money, and all of that is going to get reported, right? So people are going to write them checks and donate money online, and they're going to be making these beautiful communications pieces and all that, and distributing it every which way they can. And this is the basic function of a committee, to report all the money that comes in and all the money that goes out. So the main ballot measure committee is going to be filing regular reports that talk about, let's start with the money that comes in, contributions that are received. So they're going to be talking about money that they received. And in fact, they're going to be talking about money down to, so if Diana Alvarez is on this call, I hope you'll identify yourself. I'm still looking forward to meeting you because I used your example. I know someday I'm going to meet her. So Diana Alvarez, who lives in West Hollywood, gave $100 to the Yes on Prop 47 committee. Good for you, Diana. That is the threshold that folks have to report. Ballot measure committees have to report anyone who gives them $100 or more. Their name is going to be on this report. They give $25 4 times. The 4th time, their name is going to be on this report that they gave $100. So that's the level of detail that a ballot measure committee needs to have when they're reporting money that comes in to them. But not everything that comes into a ballot measure committee is cash. Sometimes it is in-kind contributions. And so what you see here on this report is that the Yes on Prop 47 committee actually got an in-kind contribution of staff time and expenses from the ACLU Foundation in San Diego and Imperial County. And what this shows you is that the ACLU Foundation had staff that was working on the ballot measure, and this period of time, 10/19 to 11/4, was a pay period, and during that pay period, their staff spent $7,000 worth of staff time working in coordination with the ballot measure committee. This shows you that the ACLU Foundation of San Diego didn't have to report directly to the state. They had to let their partner know that they were working on the ballot measure so that their partner could do that reporting. So this might be the kind of position that many of you would be in if you're doing a certain amount of work. And yet another thing that ballot measure committees have to report is they have to report what they spend. So a lot of that will be advertising, materials, et cetera, right? Some of it will be for things like canvassing. So they can hire other nonprofits to do that work for them. And in this case, again, still with the Yes on Prop 47 committee, they hired a nonprofit called California for Safety and Justice to do canvassing for this campaign, and they paid them. So this nonprofit has what I like to think of as a great work, which aligns with their mission to get out the vote for this great ballot measure campaign. It counts as lobbying for IRS purposes, but for state purposes, it counts as being paid by a ballot measure committee. And so the ballot measure committee is doing the reporting for you. And that is another thing that's going to show up on state ballot measure reports.
Nona, before you move on, there's a question that I think is worth hearing verbally. Are there any floors or limits on the amount of in-kind contributions? So before you shift on to this next topic.
Okay. I actually think that my next slides are going to answer that question. So
all right.
yeah, thank you so much for helping with that transition. So that was kind of the kind of guideline of what a ballot measure committee reports. But basically what I'm trying to get at here is that it's possible for a nonprofit to become a ballot measure committee, even if there's already another ballot measure committee out there, if it crosses certain thresholds. So let's talk about what those thresholds are. Thank you for that very helpful question. And this is when we're going to start to talk about a few different kinds of committees, because there are different thresholds for different kinds of committees. So the basic model of a committee is called a recipient committee because it receives money from other people. It's raising money, right? So you see here for the Yes on 28 statewide ballot measure campaign, this is their website. Right up there in the right-hand corner, it says donate. So they are trying, and I'm sure succeeding, at having people donate money to support this ballot measure. Once they raise or receive $2,000 or more in a calendar year earmarked for any ballot measure work, they become a recipient committee under state law. And the same thing can happen to you. If you're a nonprofit and you have a donor who says, hey, I know you're working to support this ballot measure, I want to give you money for that ballot measure work, that would agreeing to take that money to do that ballot measure work makes you a recipient committee under state law that has to do all the reporting that I just showed you, that has to say where all your ballot measure money came from down to donations of $100, that has to show detailed exactly where you're spending all of your ballot measure money. And the timing of the reporting is very strenuous as well, because in some cases there's 24-hour turnaround of needing to file reports. So most folks who are recipient committees pay paid preparers and campaign finance treasurers to do that work. It's not insignificant work to do that reporting, and it requires identifying your donors. So most nonprofits don't want to take that if there is that donor out there that's making that offer. Don't care to take that and would direct it to the main ballot measure committee rather than taking it into their own nonprofit. So there's the $2,000 threshold if you're taking in money that's earmarked. Now, so all of us public charities here, people donate money to us. That's how it works, right? Then we spend that money. If we spend $50,000 in 12 months or $100,000 in 4 years of money that came from donors that was not earmarked for ballot measures, maybe it was general operating grants, maybe it was donations from your gala. We spend that at those levels, $50,000 or $100,000 on ballot measure work. Then state law says, you know what, that's significant enough, you're a recipient committee now. We don't care that no one earmarked funds for ballot measures. We think that if you spend that much, you have to show us where the money came from. So then you have become a recipient committee. So that's a pretty high level of spending, but you do need to build in someone to do the reporting as a recipient committee, and you need to think about the fact that your donors are going to have to be listed. So that's a recipient committee. It's kind of a like garden variety ballot measure committee. Next type of committee out there is something called a major donor. So this is someone who is coordinating with a ballot measure committee to the extent that either, first of all, they could just be giving cash. So maybe a ballot measure committee comes to you and says, hey, we need you to contribute $15,000 to help us gather signatures for this ballot measure campaign. Can you do that? It's in line with your mission. You have the money. Great. You can make that contribution to that ballot measure committee. They're going to be documenting that because they're a recipient committee. You're going to be documenting that you're a major donor because you've given over $10,000. Now, you don't have to report who your donors are. You just have to report that you gave the money. This would also be the category that would apply if you are doing coordinated work with a ballot measure campaign. So you remember we saw that the ACLU was paying staff and it was reported as an in-kind contribution by a ballot measure committee. I think that number was 7,000. But if they had done that over more than one pay period and it came up to like 15,000 or 20,000 or whatever, they have become a major donor by doing that staff work that rises to that level. In coordination, it's considered an in-kind contribution. So that's the $10,000 threshold. Here is the lowest threshold. And here's also the reason why a lot of nonprofits, public charities that are doing ballot measure work choose to coordinate with the ballot measure committee is because if you're not coordinating, then what you're doing is called an independent expenditure. You're spending money, whether it's staff time or some other kind of communications cost, spending money, and you're expressly advocating for or against a ballot, one or more ballot measures, and you're not coordinating with the ballot measure committee. Then once you spend $1,000, you need to report as a ballot measure independent expenditure committee. Again, you don't have to report your donors in this situation, but you do have to report as an independent expenditure committee. So that would be the lowest threshold, but you wouldn't trip that threshold if you are coordinating with a ballot measure committee. So what does coordination mean? Because when you're reporting independent expenditures, you generally, the law actually presumes that you're coordinating. It's not a high bar, it's not a hard thing to do, it's a pretty easy thing to do. If you're having any kind of conversation where you're consulting the campaign, they know what you're doing and they say it's great. They asked you to do it. You're part of strategy discussions at all in any way, or you're getting emails from them. That is generally going to be seen as coordination, because if, let's say, the flip side were true and you said, oh, I'm worried, I don't know if the law would say, you know, is this really coordination or not, and you were going to report something as an independent expenditure, you're going to have to sign on that form, I swear that I didn't coordinate with anyone. And the law actually presumes that coordination is happening. And I think that makes sense, because I think that coordination and that kind of level of organization is probably helpful in getting things passed, right? This will be any kind of, like I said, conversation, consultation, using the same materials will presume that there's coordination between your efforts and a ballot measure committee's efforts. And again, also a reminder here, if you're not coordinating with anyone and you're not really making campaign type expenditures, but you're doing that public education that doesn't say, you know, clearly this is a good thing, clearly this is a bad thing, then that wouldn't need to be reported as an independent expenditure. All right. Now we get to talk about the extra special LA City rule. So tune in if you are working on a city ballot measure, and fast forward if you are not working on any LA City ballot measures. As you know, we are truly special Angelinos. I'm using my sarcastic voice here. So we have a rule that says it's not just if you're doing independent expenditures, it's not just if you spend $1,000 or more. You could actually spend as little as $100 if you're distributing a communication to 1,000 people or more. There's a filing requirement, and the form is called Form 57. It's going to give some information about you, the person who's making the expenditure. It's going to give some information about how much it costs and who you're paying out to. Like maybe, let's say you buy some Facebook ads, right? You would have to disclose that. And then you have to actually submit a copy of the communication itself to the City Ethics Commission. This form would be due within 24 hours of making that expenditure within the 90 days before the election, which is now. And this doesn't apply to media, recognized news media, but it does apply to communications that are made that clearly and unambiguously suggest that people should vote for or against a certain ballot measure. That's in LA City. So if you're reaching out to a lot of people and you're spending money to do that, keep that in mind. Okay, so I know this is a lot. That's why I like to move at this point into some things that you can do that don't have to be reported, and how you can take advantage of those activities that are not reportable. Not to say, because people do this reporting, you can do it, it's doable, but here are some things that don't have to be reported. And we have a fact sheet about this, which you will get in your follow-up email. But just a reminder that all of these kind of exceptions or things that don't have to be reported for California ballot measure purposes all still count as lobbying for IRS purposes. This is just to save you that extra step of California reporting. So this is the big one. Any staffer who spends less than 10% of their time in a calendar month, that's kind of a freebie. So you could have all of your staff spend 8% of their compensated time over the next few months working to support or oppose ballot measures. And that does not, and as long as you're doing that like in a coordinated way, then it doesn't count as an expenditure or well, it doesn't count as a contribution. So that is the freebie, 10% or less of anyone's staff time. This is a really useful framework where you can set rules within your organization. Do not spend more than 10% of your time on ballot measures without getting approval, et cetera, to allow you to really kind of control and know where those expenditures may be happening from a staff time perspective. Newsletters are another exception. So you're only distributing this this communication to people who have requested to be on your mailing list, like the Sierra Club newsletter example you see on the screen. And you're only publishing this newsletter on your regular distribution schedule into your regular list. So on the Sierra Club says we have a twice monthly e-newsletter. And so, if they want to put in that twice monthly e-newsletter their ballot measure endorsements, they don't have to do any additional reporting for that to the state of California. if they do a third installment of their e-newsletter in October that talks about their ballot measure endorsements, then that does become something that gets counted towards California reporting threshold. Another example of an exception is member communication. So the definition of members is pretty formal in California. It's going to be people who have the right to vote on corporate decisions, your board. If you have members who elect your board or have to vote on your bylaws, people who are talked about in your articles and bylaws as members, and or people who pay dues. So if you do have folks who pay dues, this may apply to you. And when you're communicating with those folks who are very formal members of your organization, you do not have to report that. There's this little exception for in-office fundraisers. And so if a nonprofit organization wants to hold an event to raise money for a ballot measure, they can have an event at their office, and if the costs for that fundraising event are $500 or less, and all the money wouldn't go to the nonprofit, it would go directly to the ballot measure campaign, then the cost of that event, that $500 and of using the office, doesn't count as a contribution that has to be tracked towards any kind of limit. So just one little exception there. And this is another one that can come up for those of you, especially that are base building organizations, organizing groups who campaigns would be wise to reach out to you and use some of that money that they're raising to support an opposed ballot measure to hire you to talk to your voters about things that you are aligned with your mission to get out the vote in favor or opposing, however it plays out, particular ballot measures. So this is something, again, that you, if you're the one being contracted to do that work from a ballot measure campaign, you don't have to report it yourself because, as we saw in the example earlier, the ballot measure committee will be reporting that. You just have to make sure that you are charging fair market value for the work that you're doing, because if you do more work than what you're paid to do, the overage of fair market value would still be considered a contribution to the ballot measure campaign. So we saw an example of this earlier with Californians for Safety and Justice. And this is good work if you can get it. So I'm wrapping up here, and then we're going to do some Q&A time. If there are, I know that it looks like they're all getting gone through in the Q&A box, so that's awesome. So kind of a wrap up here. First is track your organization's spending and contributions, including staff time, which counts as an in-kind contribution when you're supporting or opposing a ballot measure. Because A, you have to report it on your IRS Form 990 as lobbying, and B, you might have to report it somewhere for California campaign finance reports, or you might need to share it with another organization who might need to report it. Decide early on if your organization is going to be coordinating with a ballot measure or committee or working independently, because that independent expenditure $1,000 threshold comes up pretty quick, and that $100 expenditure to communicate with 1,000 people in LA is going to come up even quicker. So knowing that you have a relationship and you can have some communications with the ballot measure committee early on is going to help you navigate that. Or if you are going the independent route for whatever reason, you will need to know that up front as well. If you're raising earmarked funds for a ballot measure campaign, you will be required to disclose your contributors on campaign finance reports once you solicit or receive a total of $2,000 or more. And you will have ongoing reporting responsibilities as well to report how you've spent your money. So essentially, this is an organization becoming a recipient committee under state law. Even if you're not raising earmarked funds, you might still need to report your donors' contributions to your ballot measure expenditures if you are spending $50,000 or more. And this includes staff time. So do keep an eye on that. Spending $50,000 or more of donor funds. So here's where, again, using those non-donor funds, if you have them, would be beneficial from a reporting perspective. If your organization is working with a ballot measure committee, coordinating, the threshold for filing reports is much higher, but you are going to need to report that to the ballot measure committee so they can report it, right? So if everybody in your organization who's working on it is keeping it under 10%, or you're just doing membership or newsletter, things that are exceptions from reporting, then you don't need to worry about this. But if you have a staffer spending more than 10% of their time in a calendar month, or doing other kinds of communication expenditures, you need to let the ballot measure campaign know that so that they can report that as an in-kind contribution. A lot of folks will have kind of forms that they ask their partners to use. When you let them know, hey, we're thinking about doing X, Y, and Z. What do you think? They say, great, fill out this form. It's like that. So you're probably going to be doing that for each pay period when you know that you're in that that level of folks who are exceeding 10% of their time. Therefore, it's considered a contribution. So that's something you definitely should be talking to the ballot measure committee about once you're coordinating with them. If you're working independently, then we're thinking about, is this an independent expenditure? Again, if you're spending $1,000 or more on a state measure or a local measure in LA, and then there's this additional thing in LA of spending $100 or more to reach 1,000+ people. And so, look at these buttons, right? This is yes on Prop 67, and it says Monterey Bay Aquarium. Now, I know that Monterey Bay Aquarium wasn't the main ballot measure committee for Prop 67, so I know that if the Monterey Bay Aquarium made buttons that say yes on Prop 67, that is an independent expenditure. It's, it doesn't say it's from the ballot measure committee. It says it's from another nonprofit. If those buttons cost more than $1,000, then that would have been reported as an independent expenditure. And if it were an LA City measure and they distributed over 1,000 buttons and it costs more than $100, they would need to file that Form 57. It doesn't seem like it's too difficult to file that form. It's just something that you should know about. All right, so here we come up on our Q&A time. And I'm going to just sum this up here. Public charities can lobby. 501c3 public charities can lobby, and that includes supporting and opposing ballot measures. You can do it. You need to report it to the IRS as lobbying, stay within your lobbying limit, and you need to think about these reporting requirements in the state, but you can do it. This is something you can navigate. 501c3s can educate and mobilize voters as long as we're not supporting or opposing candidates for office, right? So please, this is very important work that we really all need to be doing to educate and to mobilize and make sure that no voter is left behind. We got to get everybody out there and participating in our elections. You can support or oppose ballot measures as a public charity, but once you're at higher levels of activity, there can be that additional reporting that's required under state law or city law. And ASJ's Boulder Advocacy Program is here to help. We are going to send out a follow-up email that has a number of resources, and I know some of these have already been discussed in the chat, but you feel free to also check out our website at Boulder Advocacy, or when you get the email, feel free to click on those links and you will see some of our resources. So at this point, I'm ready to pause and see what questions we have.
So Norma has raised her hand, and if she can be, I can unmute her actually. She has a question that I was also put in the Q&A. So Norma, take it away.
Hey, thank you both. Our organization, Fringe Benefits Theater, is planning to offer, in conjunction with the League of Women Voters, some free workshops to high school and college students in which we will teach them how to create short, get out the vote PSA videos. However, we will not be telling the participants anything about what issues to address and or which ballot measures, candidates, or parties to encourage people to vote for or against. What, if any, concerns or reporting issues would this raise, if you please? And I don't see a way to be visible.
Asking the tough questions right off the bat. I hope everybody got the basics first before I spend too much time on this one, but I'm happy to answer it, and we do have plenty of time. So I'm just saying that to give my brain a few minutes to churn here. So it's going to depend. I'm a lawyer, so it depends. It's going to depend. Here's what it's going to depend on. It's going to depend on how much you spend on this program, right? So those are some threshold questions, right? It's going to depend also on, I think one thing that comes up in a number of ways, but it's very common in the arts community in particular, is you're creating a forum. This is what I'm hearing from you, Norma. You're creating a forum for people to express themselves, and however they express themselves, you're fine with that. This is an unmoderated forum in a way, right?
Not exactly. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Nona?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's not exactly a forum. We're giving them tools to create their own videos, and we're not telling them what to vote for, what they should make their videos about, except encouraging people to get out and vote.
Are you posting
They
the
or
video?
may not choose. They may or may not choose themselves to identify a particular ballot measure, candidate, or whatever, but they're making their own videos and doing what they want with them.
Are you posting the videos on your organization's website or social media pages?
We will only post videos that do not specify a candidate, party, or ballot measure.
Got it. Okay.
But if they
so
say,
I'm sorry,
if you care about abortion rights, no, if we say, if you write something about, if you care about abortion rights, make sure to vote. That's as close as we would come to identifying.
Right. So I'm going to give a plug for another one of our training sessions where you would learn that actually, if you care about abortion rights, you should vote. Is actually that one, you might get by with that one in this election cycle in the state of California.
But not national.
But not in the context of a candidate election, and here's why. We're not allowed to support or oppose candidates for office as 501c3 public charities. I'm assuming that's your That's the situation we're talking
Yes.
about. For as in the whole going on decades that I have been practicing nonprofit law, the regs are all really old, so it's kind of like, oh, everything that's old is new again. It has always said that saying that someone should vote for a pro-choice candidate or vote for a pro-life candidate, which are the terms that are used in the regs, is code word for our major parties. So if we're talking about a candidate, it's clear that we can't encourage people to vote for candidates who will support our healthcare and abortion rights, right?
May I
as
ask?
501c3 public charities, we can't do that. However, there is a state ballot measure this year that is amending our Constitution to protect our abortion rights. So I think if this is a highly fact-specific question that would depend probably on the exact words that are used, and there's a level of risk that any organization who says something like that would be taking on as to whether if the IRS happened to look at it or questions were raised about it for some reason, whether the IRS would determine that that was seen to be supporting or opposing a candidate for office. So that was a very long answer. Go ahead.
Our videos any videos we post could be seen around the country. Plus, we would make sure to say, just plain go vote. We wouldn't say be sure to vote for the candidate or ballot measure, just go vote.
Right.
Nationally.
Right.
So
you would have to be, any of you on this call, if you're considering posting, whether it's through this awesome video making program for youth that you're talking about, Norma, or whether it's just on any organization's social media. If you're considering posting about abortion access and voting, know that you need to take a look at all of the facts and circumstances around that, and you need to know that that is very risky. But there's sometimes when it would be more appropriate because there are a number of ballot measures, not just in California, in this election cycle. So that's a question that we are happy to field on our technical assistance hotline, and maybe also something you could consider talking to your own counsel about, depending on the level of risk that you're willing to take.
thank you, and I'm so sorry to have taken up so much of your time with this.
I think that was a pretty important question for this election cycle, Norma, so I appreciate that.
And it also shows.
To answer, sorry, to get back to your more specific question, is just that you're teaching folks to make these videos and they might make a partisan video and then use it on their own. I don't think that's too, as long as that's not, there's no kind of facts and circumstances of the way that your program that was really the point of it secretly. I think it's okay for you to encourage people to express themselves and teach them how to do that. And I think you need to think about the forum that you're creating and which of that work you're highlighting and how, and sometimes you could even, if you wanted to post them all, you could, although there would be some risk to that, but you would want to have a lot of disclaimers like, we didn't moderate this at all. But I think it sounds like your approach of just posting ones that aren't lobbying and aren't supporting or opposing candidates is lower on the risk spectrum. I'm sorry, Quinn. Now I'm done.
I was just going to highlight that I like that question answered out loud too, because it shows how interrelated California ballot measure, even though that's what we're talking about, is to, what's going on with the election as well. So our next question comes from Kristen. I've unmuted you in case, Kristen, you wanted to ask it out loud, or I can read what you wrote in here as well.
Sure, I can ask it. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
So essentially just wanted to make sure I understood the reporting requirements for the city of Los Angeles. So Are we required to report on any activity that's communication with over 1,000 people that could be considered spending at least $100 in any circumstance, or only if you're considered an independent expenditure, i.e. if you're not coordinating with the campaign, the ballot measure committee?
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. It's only if you're an independent expenditure committee. So I think that when you fill out that form, there's probably somewhere on there that you would be indicating that those expenditures were not made in coordination with another committee. And so yes, I do, the way I understand it is that if you are doing your work in coordination with a committee, which probably means that those pieces and graphics and whatever form of communication it is identified as being a communication of the committee, because that's really, I think, fundamentally what's at the root here is that we want people to know where this is coming from, who's paying for it, who's really speaking right now. And so my understanding is, yeah, if you're coordinating with the ballot measure committee, then you would not need to file that form.
Thanks.
Okay. I don't know who asked this question. It was anonymous. So if you'd like to raise your hand and ask this question, I'm happy to unmute you, or I can read the question out loud as well. So I'll give folks a second.
Why don't you go ahead and read it, since I'm guessing if they asked it anonymously, they probably want us to answer it anonymously.
No worries. So the question is, are reporting requirements at each level, so the city, California, and IRS, per ballot measure, or is it cumulative? So example here is if an org is doing work on several different measures, do they calculate all the time, money, etc. per measure, or do they add them all together?
That's a great question. In some cases, it's one, and in some cases, it's the other. So if you are raising earmarked money for multiple ballot measures, one or more ballot measures, you would become a recipient committee. If you are not coordinating with ballot measure committees, and so you're an independent expenditure committee, and you are making independent expenditure about one or more ballot measures, you become an independent expenditure committee. Although it can vary also. You can choose to organize things in different ways, and the jurisdiction may have some effect to that as well. The main one that is specific mainly to one committee is a major donor. I do believe that a major donor is a major donor to a specific committee. So for the most part, you're putting your work on different ballot measures together. And except, I think the main exception is for major donors. For sure, when you're reporting to the IRS, you're reporting all your work together, and that's both ballot measure lobbying and any other kind of lobbying that you're doing on more traditional legislation. So if you're lobbying the county board of supervisors about the county budget, you're going to include that along with ballot measure lobbying, et cetera, for the IRS. Let me know if that answers your question.
There aren't any more open questions at this time, and we do have a few minutes left. Deanna, did you have some announcements you wanted to make while people think more about what questions they have?
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to turn it back over. I think we can wrap on our piece. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nona and Quinn. Always a pleasure to work with you all. Thank you everyone for joining us. Again, we will be sending a post-training email with this presentation, with the recording, with the slide deck and more resources. Also a reminder that our next training is September 8th. We will be presenting with the Center for the Study of Los Angeles at LMU on civic deserts. This training is really set to help you as you prepare for your field program. Our resources are limited, and so where does it make sense to target? What are the civic desert neighborhoods within the regions that we work in, and more. So I will share the link again on the chat, and hopefully if you haven't signed up, you can sign up. Please feel free to share it with your team. With other colleagues. But with that, I will end the training here. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.